Uh, I'm a zombie right now. I don't even know what I'm talking about. Hi, Krishan.
Hello, hello all.
Hi.
Hello.
You're probably the only person
Hi.
like not really tired right now. Fantasy is awesome.
Yeah.
That's my thing I have to say.
That's good. No, that's great. I think we're done here.
So, how about everyone introduces themselves?
I'll go ahead and jump in. I am Angela V. Chrysler, founder and owner of Brain to Books, as in Brain to Books Cyber Convention. I am also a fantasy and multi-genre author, and my fantasy is Dollar and Shadow, which is part of the part of the Tales of the Druid series. And book 2 is Fire and Lies, Tales of the Druid, and that just was released, or it will be released July 1st.
Angela, your screen is dark. Do you know that?
My screen is dark.
Because I think you might be showing your covers, which are beautiful. Oh, there we go.
Light. I have my light blocked because I have a light that does this. There we are. Yes, my books. Let me go ahead and. Is that better?
Oh, much better.
Oh,
Much better. Okay, great. This is Dollar and Shadow. It's the book 1 of the Tales of the Druid fantasy. And I've also written Broken, which is not fantasy. That's really all that matters at this point. Next.
I'm Kelly McClymer. I've written fantasy in a couple of different ways. YA fantasy, I wrote the Salem Witch Tryouts series for teenagers, and I've just started a little bit older fantasy series set in the world Evertwixt.
Mm-hmm.
I giggled because my daughter told me about that. The Salem Witch Tryouts.
She did? Well, then she needs a big hug.
She was like, "Mom, have you heard of this series?" I was like, "No, Reed didn't let me know." Because I don't read YA.
Right. Well, and it's almost middle grade. I didn't know that at the time, but it is.
But she was pleased with it. So I you just said that I would like, "Tee, I know that one."
She needs a hug. I'm telling you.
I will let her know. Since I'm running my mouth, my name is Krishan Keller-Hanna, and I am a new author. Well, I'm a new author writing under my own name. I was a ghostwriter and D&D module writer for about 15 years during the late 90s and the noughts. And now I'm writing my own series, the Alazar series. And I'm also a semi-regular co-host on the Self-Publishing Roundtable podcast. Matter of fact, I just jumped off of that podcast to do this. So, and my first release, Black Goat and Sage, which is epic urban fantasy, if you could say that, will be released April 31st, and its follow-up, Spilt Milk, will be May 28th.
Oh, who's next? My turn?
Yes,
Hi, I'm
sure.
Barbara. I'm Barbara Underwood, and I live in Australia. I'm a fairly new author. I just write one series at the moment, epic fantasy / magic realism. It's called Runa Fantasy Books. Runa is the name of the main character, the heroine. And I've written 3 books so far. I've managed to write one each year. I haven't started the 4th one yet, but I'm gearing up for the sequel. The 3rd book finished on a cliffhanger, so I've got to make this one even better. So writing 1 book a year, and I'm not sure how many there'll be in the end. I can envision about 5 or 6 at the moment, so I'm just writing and see how far I can go. So that's me.
All right, and Mary?
Oh, okay. I'm Mary R. Woldering, and I'm new to publishing of any kind, well, just for about 2 years now. I've got 2 books of a proposed 5-book series out. The series is Children of Stone, and I have the first book, Voices in Crystal, and the second, which is Going Forth by Day. And these are, I guess, the best description of them would be historical, epic, esoteric fantasy. So, because there's a lot of spiritualism in it. And I guess that's really about all I've got to say about that, except that I've just finished the 3rd book, and I'm going to try to get that out sometime this summer.
Awesome. I have...
3rd is Opener of the Sky.
Yeah. I have bits and pieces of things, so I have a lot of planned series, and right now there's Chains of Destruction as a short story in one series that's out, and Assassin is a short story in a different series that's out. And the first book in the same series as Assassin is about to come out. It was supposed to be out last week, but then convention stuff happened. And then there's a few episodes of Sorceress and Beastly, which is also epic fantasy. I don't know. I tend to... I have buckets that, like, everything else falls into, and one of those buckets is fantasy, one of them is science fiction, and one of them is fairy tales. Anyway, but I write everything. So what makes epic fantasy as opposed to some other form of fantasy?
That was a question I had, too.
Well, I can say, I think for my, I'm sorry, Angela. I just want to, just real quick for my books, I think my Salem Witch Tryout books are not epic because they basically are set in real life, sort of, with like a little magical paranormal twist to them. And, you know, anyone reading it is going to recognize the world. I do some world building and then magic, but that's it. Whereas with my other world, even though I start out in modern day Maine, I'm building an entirely different world in an entirely different land with entirely different rules. And I think that's what makes epic myself. Yeah. Sorry, Angela.
No, you're fine. You're absolutely fine. For me, and I remember when I started writing out, Dolar and Shadow started off as a romance, and there was some magic. But if you'd asked me, I would have said to you, it's absolutely a romance. I got nearly done with the book, and I was not happy at all with it. And I remember looking at it and just saying, well, it's not reaching its full potential. If I want it to have its full potential, it should probably be a fantasy. And once I made that decision, I had to completely rewrite it, reshape it, re-break its back, and set it. And I remember doing so much work on defining what fantasy was. And there's high fantasy, epic fantasy, and low fantasy. I remember researching. And one of the things that was very clearly defined is there were like a set form of rules, so to speak. 1, there must be magic in the book. 2, and this is separate from urban and all the other ones out there. This is for epic high fantasy. There is a magic system, whether it be explained through science or scientifically understandable. At the end of the day, it must be a magical magic system. The second thing is there should be or can be, most likely will be, a group of foreign creatures, whether it be animals or mythical or giants, dwarfs, elves, or talking animals in the case of Narnia, something there that's somewhat mystical creatures. The third one that really, and the 2 final ones were really what made me go, okay, that's definitely it. The third one was the world, and this is the difference between high and low fantasy. There's Harry Potter, there's Chronicles of Narnia, and then you have Tolkien's Middle Earth. I'm going to use those 3 as an example. Tolkien's Middle Earth is absolutely high fantasy because it is set in a fantastical world. There is no ifs, ands, or buts. In the case of Narnia and Harry Potter, they are in Earth, they are here, but they cross into a different magical location. And in Harry Potter's case, Scotland. And there's definitely 2 very, very specific magical worlds versus non-magical world. And that would be considered low fantasy. In all cases, Harry Potter, Tolkien, and in every fantasy, high or low epic fantasy, saga fantasy, the main character must undertake a great journey. And this can be emotional or literal, and of course in Frodo's case it was a literal journey. In the case of Harry Potter, it was very much an emotional journey. And they must defeat, and this was huge for me, they must defeat something that is greater than them. Whether or not they survive, it's a whole other topic, but they must be overcoming something, a challenge. That to me, that's what I took away with fantasy.
So would the Song of Ice and Fire be considered low epic?
I cannot tell you. I have not touched Game of Thrones at all for reasons.
No, that would be a high fantasy.
All right.
Because it's a completely different world and there is magic. It's just that it's almost like it's been forgotten about.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering because it seems like the litmus test of... I'm sorry. I'm having trouble hearing you. Let me turn up my volume just a smidge so I don't talk over people. All right. Oh, that's much better. The litmus test between low and high epic fantasy seems to be how the percentage of magic in their everyday lives. Do I have that correct?
Yeah.
No.
I mean, I was going to say in some cases, yes. I was going to say in the case of Narnia, that's not really the situation because the children are on one side and there is no magic. But once they cross into Narnia, the magic is there. Mm-hmm. So, and it's not a clear-cut description. It's funny because the sources that they pulled were from several magazines, mm-hmm. catalogs, article discussions on authors of this topic, and there was some, what is this? And there was a lot of dispute and discussion on it, so it was interesting.
So who said no just yet?
I did. So the low fantasy has a connection to the real world, mm-hmm. whereas high fantasy is an entirely different world, mm-hmm. like
this
Tolkien.
Explains so much about me to me. Okay, so I have a library of books because I read a lot and I collect them.
Okay.
So I collect books and so I have a library, and so I organize my library so I can find what I'm looking for as quickly as possible, right? And the way that I have it organized is there's like literary fiction, which is really contemporary fiction, and then there's mm-hmm. fantasy, but based on this definition, it's not fantasy, it's high fantasy. And then there's science fiction, and then there's what I call historical fiction, mm-hmm. which is anything that has any resemblance to the real world, which mm-hmm. could be probably a lot of those things would be low fantasy because I put Harry Potter in that. Well, so apparently my mind is making that distinction. I just didn't know the words.
And I think with Harry Potter, though, it's one of those interesting things because even his real world is a little bit unreal. Yeah.
And I was thinking about this too because my universe, Elazar, is a very contemporary world, but it is fueled by magic. Everything that you have, like your computer, your cell phone, everything, mm-hmm. you can only operate things that you have enough magic innately in your body to operate. So if you get tired, your phone is going to die. Unless it has some way, unless it has some kind of capacitor. To hold that. And so I was thinking, like, I like to think that I write contemporary epic fantasy because it is a brand new world, is all magical, but they have cell phones and cars and things like that. They also have a total bestiary of creatures there, and even the plants mm-hmm. are sentient, right?
Yeah, I love that. Mm-hmm.
So I like to think that that's epic fantasy.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if epic also has to do with
here I am lost
the size of the story.
I'm kind of lost again. Is it okay?
Mm-hmm.
If people,
if you're confused, ask a question.
Well, I didn't want to overtalk over somebody. As I said, mine's historical fantasy because that's basically what my writers group told me it was. Mm-hmm. But it's set in historical ancient Egypt. There's magic, there are real people who you could look up, Google, and find out that were actually pharaohs and priests and stuff. But there are also fantastic people who came out of here, you know, and they're and there's mythological creatures too. Basically, see the gods as all shapeshifters. So
if I was
don't
putting
know if
your
that's
book,
high.
if I was putting that book on my bookshelf, I would put it in historical fiction.
Oh, even though it's got all the fantasy in it too, and
Harry Potter is historical fiction to me.
Oh, okay.
Urban fantasy is historical fiction to me. Okay. And I think how Angela was explaining the difference between high fantasy and low fantasy, to me, that was an aha moment because I've been classifying things that way. I was just using different words.
Yeah.
So now I know the things that I would consider historical fiction. Most of those things are low fantasy.
Okay. Let me ask you this, because this is very peculiar. What moment in history is Harry Potter trying the story correlates with? Because let's talk about Henry Turtledove.
Like within the past, I mean, it is contemporary.
20 years. Yes, it is contemporary.
Like, I grew up with him, so like when the book came out, I was the same age as him. So to me, it was the history of yesterday.
Yes.
Okay.
She actually gave a birth year for Harry Potter, which we can Google that, and that's
true.
Exactly the age of Harry. I think he's 30 now. In his
I think
20s.
he's the same age as one of my sons.
Yeah. Right. No, but I think it's that I've always considered historical fiction something that correlates with a historical event that actually happened in the real. Let me finish. That actually happened in the real world, just like Henry Turtledove going back. It's World War II, or the Man in Hightower, which is once again World War II. These are actually that you can actually linchpin it into. Somebody's music is playing. That you have to linchpin it to actual, current, real events. Right? So you're saying that Harry Potter is historical fiction because it tells a fictional history?
Yeah,
is that also
that's my definition, I guess.
And I have to say this. I'm sorry. This is like, I struggled with this because there's just so many becauses here. My book, Dollar and Shadow, takes place in the 10th century Norway with the first Norwegian king, who is very historical. And I had this massive historical line running right through the book. And everything, my main characters, were bouncing and interacting off of this historical timeline with this magic system. And I also had Norse mythology over here, bouncing off of that. And the three of them were literally braided together. So from that, I was going, is it historical fantasy? Was it epic or saga? I struggled with categorizing this so much.
Yes, I do too.
Call it now. So what do you call it now?
I call it epic saga fantasy because my reviewers have called it that.
Oh, okay. Because I started out with mine being classed as historical fiction, but the first people I presented it to actually on Goodreads said, well, there's magic in here, and there's things that really didn't happen in history here. How can you call it, you know? So I went, they were telling me it was fantasy.
Understanding how you define things and how the bookstores define things and where readers are looking for certain things within certain genres, right? So the people who are looking for historical fiction, they want the history told to them as a story instead of as facts and figures.
Oh, I see.
And I knew that distinction growing up because my dad is a history buff. And I knew that for me it was historical because it had some relationship to history of some time in some way. So urban fantasy and paranormal and all of that stuff, to me personally, gets put in my historical fiction thing, but really it's low fantasy, and that's what other people would classify it as, and I never knew how to explain that to anybody until just now.
That's interesting. I've been using the term magical realism lately. So I guess that's something like low fantasy. And
well, I don't know, is it? Because
what is that?
To me, magical realism is when you're writing a literary story that happens to have stuff happen where you don't know if it is really happening or if it's in someone's head or if there's magic.
Yeah.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, I've got.
To me, that's what magical realism is.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Well, my characters are basically in ancient Egypt, ancient civilizations. So it's historical, maybe historical fiction now, and the characters. Not all of the characters. It's a bit like Harry Potter. You know, some have the magical powers and the psychic ability and things like that. But otherwise, it's pretty much down to earth. And I'm thinking along epic fantasy lines because the story of my main character is epic. You know, it's going to be many books, and she's going to conquer different countries, societies, civilizations. Of course, the enemy.
Are you writing about Cleopatra?
No, this is just my own imagination. She's not based on any particular person, but everything else, the setting, like the pyramids and things like that in ancient Egypt and other ancient civilizations, they're there. So readers, even though I've used different names, the reader should be able to recognize, oh, okay, the pyramids, that's obviously Egypt.
Let me ask this. How much of epic fantasy also has to do with scope? That is to say, if this takes place in the entirety of the world you have created, people going to different places, or it concerns something more than the people in a, let's just say, in a room, right? If you had a story where it took place in a foreign, in an alien or foreign world, a magical world, but the actual events only took place in a single room, can you call that epic?
I think it depends on the emotional feeling that you get from reading the story. I think epic has this feeling of honor, of valor, of doing something for the greater good.
Yeah,
and so you can have that internal journey. You know, maybe it's a short story, and the epic journey is to go from thinking that you're hopelessly incompetent at everything to realizing that you have to go out on the quest, on the physical quest, because you have to save the world and you're the only person that you can trust to do that.
That defines my character. Yeah, that's about describing my character. That's good.
Would you say it is?
This really, I don't know if you have watched it. It's called The Power of Myth. I have to Google to get some more information on.
It's great.
Thank you. Yes, you do know. And yes, Joseph Campbell with BBC's Power of Myth. And I sat down with a notebook and took notes of the whole thing. But if you have not had the pleasure, it is without a doubt the #1 recommendation I have. Like if you are going to die in about 12 hours, you do it watching Power of Myth. This is a phenomenal knowledge. So amazing.
I actually attended a lecture by Joseph Campbell. I go back that far.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, exactly. He my goodness, he talks about Star Wars and he breaks it down into the story, and through Power of Myth he explains how, and to me it was very epic, and if it had been fantasy it would have been epic fantasy. And he explains the trials and how I saw so many similarities between Star Wars and Tolkien. You have the underdog, you have this great quest above him, you have this great journey he goes under. He's got a Gandalf-like figure that they die. That would be the Obi-Wan when Obi-Wan dies, and then he goes on to be a master. And he said everything happens in threes. And there was a panel I saw in Pinterest where it was comparing Lord of the Rings and Star Wars and Harry Potter. And it broke it down to the 20 mandatory things that make it epic.
Right.
And fantasy, of course, is just the genre, but the word really was the emphasis on epic. They all had a magical item. They all had the great teacher who died. They all had a character who kind of was the underdog. They even all had some really weird out there creature, and they tied that into Chewbacca and Dobby and I can't remember the one that they used for Lord of the Rings. It was just amazing, the similarities, the parallels.
And
So,
if you
in
go,
other
if you
words,
go
if
and
it doesn't
rewatch
follow,
the science fiction panel we just had, most people on that panel would classify Star Wars as fantasy.
right? Because what you're talking about is generically called the hero's journey.
Yes,
Which we also had a panel on.
Right. So that's exactly what that is. All those points are the hero's journey.
Yeah.
Now, going back to my question, um, what Aurelia was talking about is the section of hero's journey where they call it denial of the destiny, as in, or refusal to go on the quest, then going on to acceptance of the quest. This is right before they actually take their journey, which is them getting off of Tatooine and going forward, or them actually leaving the Shire and going on, or Harry Potter actually going to the Wizarding World and Diagon Alley. That's them accepting the quest, and then you go and you do a bunch of other things that are not where they began. My question, once again, is if they never leave the room, if they never take the journey, if they never go outside that room and go to another location geographically, right?
Yes.
Can you call that epic?
No. And I have 2 counts for calling that epic. The first one is, and I'm coming back to this just once more this weekend. I was a shut-in, and there is something psychologically that happens to you when you take your first step out that door. And the second point that I strongly support with that is Gandalf's very own words. It's such an easy step, taking that first motion out that door. But once you do, you never know where your feet are going to take you.
Right.
And that I think they do have to leave their room. They have to take a step out that door.
Right.
Unless it's a wardrobe in your house and you're going through a magical wardrobe.
But you're still taking that step, right? You're still taking that step out. So scope has a big part to do with whether or not our stories are epic.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well,
go ahead.
I was thinking that you don't necessarily physically have to leave the room, could mentally leave the room. Say if you're a person who is a dreamer or a psychic or someone of that nature, your mind or your spirit can leave the room, but your body stays there. Say a person who's paralyzed, for instance, can their journey, if they leave, if their consciousness leaves and goes to another place, can that be considered epic? Just a question. I don't have a story like that, but it's a thought.
I think the narrative, it would be the surrogate of them physically leaving. If the narrative takes you out of that room, I think it does. The reason why I'm asking this is because there was a mystery, and for the life of me, I cannot remember what the name of it was, where it takes place in this guy's hospital bed. He's gotten roughed up and turned over. Somebody just stuffed a mud hole in him and walked it dry. And he's in his hospital room, and he solves the mystery through looking through the case file.
It's a series. I can't remember the name of it either, but he's like paralyzed, like in the vertebrae that he's paralyzed at. It's really fragile, so he can't do anything. I love that series.
Right.
That was the best series.
It was incredible.
They made it into a movie. They made it into a movie. The first one, which I didn't see.
I can't remember it.
So my question
is that Bone Collector?
Yes, thank you.
My question is, if he's looking through the case files, then he is leaving the room mentally.
And I think that's actually very true. I mean, I don't know if I would call it an epic mystery, but it was amazing.
Through the photos and through the reports, and he's leaving the room in the same way that you leave the room when you read a fantasy novel.
Well, he essentially uses another character as sort of his avatar,
Right, to lead.
frustrating her to a great extent.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's a really. I think you could do something like that with a fantasy and then call it epic.
Right.
I do think you could, but yeah, most people probably haven't yet. So one of us has to do
But there's
that.
another aspect to epic fantasy where I think it lends itself more to large casts of characters. And I think a lot of other genres focus on one person or maybe two people. And I think a large portion of epic fantasy has a lot of people, all of whom have journeys, all of whom have to succeed at their journey in order for there to be a resolution to the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, Tolkien comes to mind there. I mean, Harry Potter is really
and Cloud
about
Atlas
Harry Potter.
as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the thing is that the Hobbit is a singular hero.
True.
Yes and no.
I view all
Because
four
there's all the
Hobbits.
dwarves, and there's Gandalf, and there's the
But
humans
they
in
are
town.
supporting cast. They
Okay,
are the
we're-
assistants
I don't know.
and the guide.
Yeah,
And
Bilbo
if you're
is
talking
the
about in the
hero.
hero's journey, go
Yeah.
ahead.
Bilbo is the hero. Now, if you are looking at Frodo, I would say it's Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a group.
I think
Yes.
Aragorn as well, though, and Gandalf.
I think he's
Because
more a
they-
secondary character.
He is.
But I think his journey is important, and
Mhm.
and he has to succeed at becoming the person he's supposed to be.
Yes.
And if he had not succeeded at that, then
Mhm.
they wouldn't have won the battles.
Yes, he's a stakes character,
So-
which is a side
so-
character.
Yes.
He's a stakes character, one who
I don't
emphasizes
agree
and
with that.
exemplifies how important the main group's, the hero's journey, actually is. I am really into the hero's journey, so
Yeah, no.
Have you
no,
seen The
I
Power of
love
Myth?
discussing the hero's journey. It's wonderful.
Krishan, have you seen The Power of Myth?
I have, and I was looking and I was like, isn't that a docu? And yes, it is, and I remember it because I was about 15 years old.
Mhm.
And when I saw it, it was on PBS, and I was 15 years
It was
old.
with Bill Moyer, yeah?
Right, and it blew my mind.
Well, the thing
Yeah.
about it is, Joseph Campbell did that after he'd written The Hero's Journey,
Mhm.
and after he'd had some time to reflect on it.
Mhm.
So it's kind of interesting because at one point he's asked, well, what about the heroine's journey? And he gave a different answer than he gave earlier in his career, which is women don't have a journey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So
This is why we had the heroine's journey panel, which you can go back and watch whenever you'd like.
Right.
And I'll tell you, all your panel discussions, that
And-
should have come up in your
I'll-
woman's discussion.
All
As
of my
long
panel
as you're not talking
discussions
about the
have, like,
opiate?
tied into each other. I'm not.
No.
Yeah, no. I've been trying to say heroine, but to me that's the wrong pronunciation. And
No, I'm talking about Campbell.
Yeah.
No, but it's interesting to see in that interview how some of what he's, because he continued his research into the myth and the power of myth into the end of his life, and so his understanding really deepened even from writing the hero's journey, and you could really tell that in that interview. So I listened to it, actually. I have it on my iPhone, and I listen to it often when I go for walks, because I like to try and remind myself that this is actually a growing thing. We're just starting to really talk about these things and sort of figure out how they fit into our real lives, and I think that's exciting. But yes, women do need I know this is epic fantasy, but I do have a plug for the heroine's journey.
well, and
Heroine's
I
journey.
think you have to have both to have it be an epic fantasy. Like if you think about Frodo, he has an internal journey that his external journey happens to be paralleling. The closer he gets to his physical destination, the worse he is internally, and he has to overcome that, and he can't overcome that internal
Well, his
issue.
is almost the typical
he gets rescued. He
feminine
gets saved.
side
His heroine's journey gets cut off, literally, when Gollum bites his finger.
Yes. Yes,
You know,
exactly.
like he is not given the opportunity to have that growth experience.
But he doesn't have the warlike nature of all of his other compatriots, he and Sam. And in some ways, I guess Sam is the essentially the most beta of the journeys. We had a discussion about whether or not to say feminine, because a man or a woman can have a heroine's journey because it's just a different journey.
Yeah.
But Sam, I guess, is the one. Without that humanity, without that need to destroy everything and conquer, then there would not have been a successful conclusion to that quest, because they needed to throw away the power, and that is not what the hero's journey is about. The hero's journey is about owning the power and using it well.
And Samwise is more they sometimes call it the romantic support, a romantic subplot, but in this case it's more the emotional and nurturing subplot.
Yeah.
Because without Samwise there and his emotional support and his emotional venting, the journey would have stopped. Truly.
Yeah.
Frodo would have failed.
Yes, he would have failed.
Sam is strong where Frodo isn't when it comes to the internal things.
Partly because he's not being affected by the ring.
Correct.
And like
his
all
goal.
life in Lord of the Rings again. Oh, Gollum, yes. Let's talk Gollum. Gollum, that was the weird creature.
Yes.
It was Chewbacca, Dobby, and Gollum. Okay.
And the eagles, and the spiders, and elves, and dwarves.
But Gollum was a very strong creature that you kind of, in the movie especially, you kind of identified with, and at a certain point, you begin to feel sorry for him. The addict who can't.
It's an anti-hero in a way.
Yeah.
He's almost an anti-hero.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, the I hate you, when he puts his hand on his head and he just starts crying and he says to the other self, his sub-self, I hate you. And it just, I think there's so much depth to Gollum. It is not, he is the us, he is the potential, he is the extreme if we ever let our deepest evils come out. Or there's just so much that Gollum is and could be. And at the same time, he is ourselves. He is that gimme that resides in all of our consciousness. It just, Gollum, we could do a panel just on Gollum. Let's call it the Gollum discussion.
Good.
It's a deep, ongoing discussion. Gollum is.
I'm going to be right back. I neglected to feed my furry animals, and they are letting me know. I will be back in about 2. Okay.
I thought it was an interesting point that to be epic, it also involves the emotional journey, not just what happens physically with people in different places and different countries, but the main character's personal development. And that's what I'm actually doing with my character, so it's good to hear that I'm on the right track with what I'm doing, because with each event or obstacle she has to overcome, she grows and gets a different view of the world, which is basically how it happens in real life to us, isn't it? So hopefully the reader can relate to that part of it, to the growth and development.
And I think it's important to have both of those parts, because at least for me, the stories that I love to read over and over again are the stories where they're forced to do this internal work because they have to do this external thing.
Yeah.
And that, to me, inspires me to do the internal work, because you never know what life is going to throw at you, and maybe it's a little problem. Maybe it's, having to call the water company. I hate talking on the phone. So to me, having to call the water company feels like
it's
an
a
epic
big
quest.
deal. Yeah, it's a big deal. It is Yes, I see you
Yeah.
now. Donna your armor to dream the impossible. Dee, 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 dee. Yeah, I see that. No,
Yeah, I hate, I don't know what it is, but when I can hear someone but I can't see their face, it's just the worst.
Mm.
Hmm.
Yeah. That's why I like the panel discussions on Google Hangouts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I try to do all my meetings on Hangouts or FaceTime now. It's just better.
Even my
Even
grandmother likes FaceTime better than talking on the phone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, well, that's the way it's got to go now with technology developing all the time. Soon we'll be like that all the time, being able to see the person we're talking to.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't get to visit my grandchildren because they live several states away, so that's how I have grandchildren.
me too.
Yeah. And it's like magic. We were talking about this on the world building one, I think.
But we need a better butt dialing preventer because you don't want
That's
to
true.
accidentally butt dial when you can FaceTime.
Well, and it's not just butt dialing. My mom's phone will
Yeah.
call her favorites. It's not butt dialing. It's just the phone is sitting there and it decides to call one of her
Oh, it's the
favorites.
technology taking over. It's
Yeah,
decided your mom needs
it's really weird because I'll be like, What's wrong, Mom? Why are you calling me? Aren't you on your way to work? Like, did you get like stuck on the side of the road? Did something happen?" And she's like, "No, my phone just decided to call you."
Oh.
Yeah, but yeah.
Mm.
So why does everybody write fantasy? What is it about fantasy? Because I will tell you that I had this really strange conversation with my book group, and I suggested a science fiction novel, The Girl with All the Gifts, which I highly recommend, but it's not epic fantasy, it's science fiction, and I recommended it to them, and they were very hesitant. And so a couple of them said, well, I don't read fantasy and I don't read science fiction and I don't understand why it's interesting to people. So we discussed it. But what I realized later was that one of the books that we had chosen, one of these people who actually said this to me had chosen for us to read was The Song of Achilles, which I guess she classed as historical fiction, like Aurelia. And so she didn't care that it had gods and sea monsters and magic. To her, that was not fantasy. That was history.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I have a friend who's like that, and she won't read fantasy. Like, she grudgingly read Harry Potter because it happened to be mostly real life with some magic in it. But she doesn't understand why fantasy is valuable. And for me, I read fantasy because it lets me explore things that I can't explore in the real world.
Mm. Yeah, that's important. Yeah. And a lot of people haven't got to that stage perhaps to understand that, or maybe they just haven't read the right fantasy book where it suddenly clicks and they can relate to what's going on.
Right, or they think it's about the world building,
Yeah.
but really it's about the story and it's about exploring, okay, if things were like this, then what would the problems be and how would we overcome it and what challenges would we face that maybe we don't face every day in real life?
Well, I think with the people that I know that objected to it, it was more of a trust thing. They didn't think they could trust the fantasy worlds because they were made up, as opposed to the things that were grounded in reality. Because there are a lot of people who don't read fiction for that reason. They only read nonfiction because it's real. And I happen to think that epic fantasy fiction is sometimes more real than reality because you get down to the stuff that you can't talk about sometimes in the real world.
Yeah. And it goes back to something else we were talking about in the world building panel which is the world is internally consistent.
Yeah.
And that is the sign of a good fantasy story as opposed to a not good fantasy story, right? Like maybe you don't happen to like the style of the author, but if they've done a good job, even if you don't enjoy the story, their systems are real within the context of that story, and there's consistency. And so when it is a good fantasy story, there is that trust there. And maybe the people who don't read fantasy, maybe they have only been exposed to poorly developed worlds. Maybe they're I mean, and there are a lot of poorly developed movie worlds, and
But every
maybe
story
they're
requires you to, what is the phrase? But it's basically leave your preconceptions and your
suspension of
prejudices.
disbelief.
Yes, and I think some people just have a really hard time suspending disbelief.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
apparently none of us do.
It's interesting. I've tried my hand at reading fantasy, and there are so many. I'll sit there and try and get through them, and it's like rubbing wooden barrels on my eyes. It is just like, okay, I see the story, but it is such dry writing. It is very stale. And that's one of the things that I loved about Patrick Rothfuss is he came in with a sweeping, fresh voice, gorgeous imagery. If only he had a story. I was so unsatisfied with his story. To me, it was very menial. It was just.
Well, it's not finished, and so it feels unfinished, and then you're not satisfied at the end.
I feel like I've read 2 books worth of, or I feel like I've read half a book's worth of information after 2 full books. And
Yes.
I'm like, okay, I've gotten 2 books through this, and I have almost no information. He still hasn't killed a king, so I don't understand the King Killer Chronicles. And at this pace, I feel like that's going to be something that happens on the very last chapter of the very last book. I see training, and I'm like, okay, so you go into training, he's in school. And then he goes into training again with the second book. And I feel like all he has done is train and had some schoolyard fights with a bully. And I'm like, where's the adventure? Where's the story? I see the journey. I see my most enjoyable part of this book, and I love the moment when he was actually impoverished. He had found his parents dead, and then he moved into the city, and he was a poor boy stricken in the snow there. That moment, that very short period in the beginning of book 1, was the most enjoyable part of the story. And then he got out of that, and his journey to the school, I thoroughly enjoyed that. But as soon as he arrived at the school, I felt like the story ended and just stalled out. And I feel like he's been stuck in that rut since, and I'm going, great, now can we get on with the story? And I was expecting that with book 2, and it never happened. And I would not call the King Killer Chronicles an epic anything. To me, it's just a fantasy. Gorgeously written.
The thing I would say about that, though, because I haven't read those books, but I will say that Harry Potter does that actually quite well, because we know that he is going against Voldemort at some point.
Right.
Well, and
but he doesn't.
He has to defeat Voldemort in every book.
He does.
At a different level. It's a very different level.
And he has to defeat him over and over and over again, and each time it's a bigger struggle.
Exactly. Right. So there is that cycle in each book. So, and I don't know the author you're talking about. Yeah. Perhaps he missed that.
I think pattern. It's a case of, you know how Tolkien, it's really The Lord of the Rings is 1 book, but it got published as 3. I feel like Patrick Rothfuss is writing 1 book that happens to have been published as a series.
Yeah.
And I can relate to that in many ways, because in certain of my series are like that.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're doing that, each episode or each segment needs its own battle.
Yes.
Even if it doesn't end, it needs. And that's what. I do think J.K. Rowling does that very, very well.
Yes, she does.
At the end of every Harry Potter book, Harry's done well, but he still has a huge new battle coming up because Voldemort is not defeated.
Yeah, and you know this, and I ran right into this exact problem. I wrote Dull Earned Shadow, and I finished that thing at 250,000 words. And one of the agents came back and said, this is phenomenal, but it's 250,000 words. You should probably consider cutting it in half. And I did, and this is like 190,000. And it is definitely, for me, it's part one of two. And one of the struggles that I had when I cut it in half was, okay, I still have to have a climax. I still have to have this arc, and suddenly I had to rewrite it after cutting it in half and building in this arc. And no, you're not going to finish the book with a complete satisfaction. You are going to be left with some questions. You are going to have somewhat satisfactory, I hope, if I did it right. But to me, it's definitely part one of two. And I had one person who came back and said it needed to be cut in half again. And I had another reviewer actually get into an argument with my reviewer and said, and he didn't know it was already cut in half, he said it just needs to be cut in half. It would have been done better if it was cut in half. And one reviewer came on right after that and said, no, you don't cut this in half. It was perfect. I loved it. Another woman came on and said, well, I felt like there was way too many unanswered questions. There was no finale. So there is, when you have a series with fantasy, there is like a small, I see it like that.
I call them nesting story stars.
Yeah, perfect.
Because I think of it as a 5-act structure instead of a 3-act structure, but really they're the same.
Yeah.
Because the 2 points in the 5-act structure that are missing in the 3-act structure are the transitions in between each of the 3 points. So,
and I definitely felt that with Patrick Rothfuss. I did feel like there was an arc that does that. He had that down. But, and I was not unsatisfied with book one. I put book one down and went, wow. But he really seriously flubbed book two. Book one was great. But book two was as prolonged and stretched out as the Twilight series books 1, 2, and 3. And I'm just like, why am I dragging this out? Why am I having to suffer through all of this when, I mean, honestly, I put it down, there's only 2 parts that I can really pull out of my head and go, okay, why couldn't that been condensed into book 1 or smaller, like a little section? And I was just so horrifically unsatisfied with book 2 that I'm looking at his book 3 going, are you going to be able to recover from this? Because he's got so much ground now to make up for it because he didn't cover it in book 2.
Yeah. This is why I think in the full series, even if individual books are almost standalones, I still think in the context of the series because for me the story is over the whole span of the series. Even if there's individual things going on in each one. And often I think the story starts here and it really starts way back here. For me anyway.
And with fantasy, there are so many places to go. You always have a new country spring up.
So I put a draft of the first chapter of my story that's my baby. I put it up on Scribophile because I was trying something out with dialogue and putting in thoughts and stuff, and I wanted to see what people's reactions was to doing that, and they didn't like it, and that was sort of what I expected, which is fine. But one of the things that one of the people who reviewed that particular chapter said to me, she said, I hope they don't leave the city before we find out what happens at this school. But their school has no relevance to the story at all. The school that they're in the city they start in, is completely irrelevant to everything. They go to school because they're 14. End of story. So, like, this school is going to be mentioned because they come home from school and then they decide to leave. And so it's mentioned. But I'm never going to tell you anything about that school because I don't know anything about that school because I don't care about it. It's not relevant. Now, there's a different school that is later, which I also don't tell you about. So there's the first book is them going to this other school. They don't realize that that's where they're going at the beginning. They find that out in the middle. But I don't. The middle book, which might be middle books, depending on how I do it, which is why I haven't written it yet. It's not their experience at that school. They've been at that school for several years, and it's their final exams, which are their practicums. Those are the stories that are important. Because going to class, you're learning how to think and you're learning the tools, but it isn't a story.
Yeah.
And so it is going to jump because having class is not relevant to saving the world. I mean, you have to go to class to learn what you need to learn to like gain the experience you need to gain, but the story is there is no story.
Yeah.
It's a thing that happens, and like you know that it happens, and there will be references to it, but it's not going to make it on. No, I'm not going to write a book telling you how school happens because you really won't want to read it. I can promise that you will not want to read it. Well, anyone have any last words?
This has been fun.
Fantasy rules.
Fantasy rules. Yes.
It is. Yeah. It is the best. It's awesome. Yeah. That's actually one of the things I love about every genre is that you can do everything with every genre. Yeah. So like you can have a romance that's a fantasy, and you can have a fantasy that's a romance, and you can have a fantasy that's a political thriller, and you can have a political thriller that's science fiction. And
yes.
This is why I don't write one genre.
Yeah. So. Yeah, these discussions are really inspirational. You know, I learn a lot myself. I feel like I've really gained and developed and grown a lot in just 1 hour, just talking and hearing and comparing and being inspired.
Yeah, very much.
Good.
Very much.
Right.
I have to ask, Aurelia, you are on, how many panels did you run this weekend?
There were 12 total.
How's your brain?
Well, I was definitely a zombie for the zombie panel. Which you
I'm so glad you were there. No, that was wonderful.
So you can tell that I'm a zombie during that panel because I think I said maybe 4 sentences in the entire hour.
Well, no, you were the I know nothing about zombies and I don't like them.
Well, I know a little bit about them, but
and it was wonderful.
Yeah, they're nightmares.
She's like, I know. So
I have epic fantasy dreams that are like as graphic as Game of Thrones, and that doesn't make me feel afraid.
Yeah.
So it doesn't qualify to me as a nightmare because I don't feel fear. I know it's a dream. I know I'm gonna overcome the bad guy because ever since I was 2, I have. I had this dream when I was little, where I had to save my community from a guy who was going to shoot everybody. And to do this, I had to run faster than he could so that I could hide behind a bush so that I could, like, be sneaky and attack him from behind because I was 2. And I had this dream on repeat because the first time I had it, I wasn't big enough to run because I was, like, I don't even know how young I was. And my mom was totally freaking out about me having this dream because I had never been exposed to guns. I didn't know what they were, or I shouldn't have known what they were because I wasn't allowed to watch TV. I was not exposed to popular culture. I wasn't exposed to the news. And so she was like freaking out. Oh my god! Oh my god!
Brings up the whole past life thing.
Yeah, I mean, eventually I overcame this one particular guy, and ever since then, I've never feared. When it's a fantasy type dream, I've never feared that I was. But when it's zombies, if I go to sleep, the zombies are gonna get me and eat me, and like I'll be asleep, so I won't be able to like run away. Yeah.
Okay.
That's what I need to do. Fantasy. Yeah.
Fantasy plus zombies. I sort of have that, but I can't tell you about it because it's a spoiler.
Okay.
All right. Time to go do the closing ceremony. Angela, do you want to tell people where to go?
Yes, we are going to be on YouTube and Google Plus. I just sent out a bulletin about 20 minutes ago, half an hour. I've had to run the convention all while plugged into these panel discussions. So I'm like in here, and I'm like over here like this. And I feel bad, but
You look amazing.
Good job, though.
thank you, thank you. Good, I convinced everyone. So I went ahead, sent out a bulletin providing everyone the YouTube link. If you are wanting to join the panel physically, we do recommend you just go ahead and email me at angelabchrysler@yahoo.com, and I will CC Joe into it, and he will send you the link if you're wanting to jump in. And we're going to go ahead and announce the final Cover War winner at around 9 o'clock. And we have a lot going on. It's really exciting.
Yeah, I have to.
Giveaways will be awarded.
I have to. Yeah.
Honors you will be joining us, right, Aurelia?
Yes. I'm about to. I'm gonna jump in, and then I'm going to mute myself and go to, make sure I have tea and all of that.
Yes,
and then
yes.
I'll
And I'm probably
be
going to do the
on,
same.
but I'll be doing the giveaway stuff.
And at one point, I do want to get all of our event hosts together. I think Matt's already signed off because we had Japan, Greece, and England leave us. Their day is behind. And I know Jin went to bed. He's in Japan, and I think he'll be back on for the closing ceremony tonight. And if you are an author or anyone who participated as a presenter in the convention, we are doing an after party over at Facebook. There's absolutely no authors there to sell to. You are just lounging and taking a big breath. So if you are wanting to join us there, I will be providing the link, which is up backstage at Goodreads. So, yeah.
Right. Thank you. Thank you.
2 hours left to go.
everyone.
We can do this. 3 hours, I should say. 3 hours left.